Well, Josh, you're mostly right, and I think that's a great segue to tell a little bit of the backstory of Leonard Cohen leading up to and including how this record actually got recorded. So, as was already alluded to, this is ultimately a story about a midlife career change. And I found that element of it a little bit fascinating, but I think it leads to some of the flaws we talked about. So, Leonard Cohen had a career already as a published poet, a reasonably well respected poet.
Where's those gigantic air quotes around career in poetry?
We're going to get into it, but you have to understand it was a different time, right? But what was happening as the 50s changed into the 60s is youth culture shifted, right? And he has this important realization that poets don't make any fucking money anymore. Or maybe they never did, but they're not even a part of the hip zeitgeist like maybe they were in the 50s. So let's go back to the beginning of his life. He's born in Montreal in 1934 to a very well off Jewish family. They basically lived in what was referred to as the Bel Air of Montreal. His mother was a Russian immigrant. His dad ran a high end tailor clothing business. He often is quoted as saying, Leonard is, that he was born in a suit. Like he's never been in casual clothes, which sort of fits, I think, his aesthetic.
In a fedora, right?
Exactly. And he's quite dour. I don't know if you guys
That
noticed from
comes with the suit.
the
I think it's
cover
like a
photo.
package deal. Wait, hey, for the second I saw that cover photo, by the way, I also don't key that much in on covers. I just basked in the possibility that some kid picked this up in like the 70s off the rack at a record store thinking it was like the Godfather soundtrack.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because that is fucking Al Pacino on the cover.
Right,
I don't
right.
care what anybody says.
Very Pacino-esque. So he's an odd kid, kind of from an early age. There was a story I picked up on in this memoir I read about him where he took one of his father's bow ties and sliced it open and wrote what he says is his first piece of writing ever on a crumpled piece of paper, puts it in the bow tie, buries it in the backyard. Now he claims he has no memory of what he wrote, and in his words, he's been digging in the garden for years. Maybe that's all he's been doing. He's a weird kid. He's a weird kid. As a teenager, he gets into hypnotism and was like very serious about practicing from this hypnotism book that he has.
I'm
And
guessing all in the pursuit of hypnotizing ladies into having sexual relations with him.
perhaps surprisingly to
Are
you
there
guys,
other
but he is
purposes?
quite a ladies' man as well.
Oh,
So
I
He's a
was
good looking
not
guy.
I was not surprised by the fact that he was a ladies' man. It seems to go with his whole aesthetic, but the extent to which he was obsessed with women and sex kind of threw me off a little bit. I'm sure we'll get into that.
so this memoir I read was talking about his time as a hypnotist, and I think he learned a lot about it, and I think it influenced his musical career even. And so I have this quote from the hypnotism book from the second chapter of this book with some sage advice that I think he applied consistently. It says, your features should be set, firm, and stern. Be quiet in all your actions. Let your voice grow lower, lower, till just above a whisper. Pause a moment or two. You will fail if you try to hurry. I never thought about the intersection of hypnotism and this kind of music, but I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition. Okay, so he's from a well-off family. He has music lessons. He has piano lessons as a kid. He played the recorder. I think he played the clarinet in high school. But really, he has this lightning strike moment. He's walking around Montreal at age 15. He's browsing a bookstore, and he opens up a book of poems by a guy called Gabriel Garcia Lorca. And he stops randomly on a poem, and it's this crazy moment in his life. It makes his hair stand on end. For context, Lorca is a famous Spanish poet. He was openly gay. He was an anti-fascist, and he ended up being executed by the nationalist militia in the mid 1930s. But this really kind of sets Leonard on a path of what he wants to do, right? So I feel like we can't tell the story of Leonard Cohen without apologies, because I have lots of quotes of things he said, because I do think he undeniably has a way with words. Perhaps you guys are going to deny that, but poetry like this revealed something to Leonard, and in his own words, it revealed a landscape that you thought you walked alone on. When something was said in a certain kind of way, it seemed to embrace the cosmos. It's not just my heart, but every heart involved, and the loneliness dissolves. And you felt that you were this aching creature in the midst of an aching cosmos, and the ache was okay. In fact, it was the way that you embraced the sun and the moon. So clearly he has some kind of connection to this ancient thing. And I know it's easy to make fun of poetry. It feels very antiquated. It feels very pretentious. I just think that's a very modern opinion, right? It has been this thing that's been going on in human history for so long, and I think we should just take a moment to like accept that, right?
Listen, I don't have inherently a problem with poetry itself, but poets seem like they're insufferable assholes. And Leonard Cohen seems like me and Lenny could not go get beers. I would 20 minutes in and be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Can you just say normal things like a normal person? He's a guy who declaims everything. He doesn't say things. He like makes statements. You're like, okay.
Yeah, let me follow up on my thoughts on him being a really unique voice and having this way with words, though, because I have this personal anecdote that always stuck with me. I don't know a lot of his music. I'd heard some of the songs passingly over the years, but I'm definitely not familiar with the catalog. And one time a few years back, I was watching a TV show and the theme song chimes in and it's a woman singing. It's like a dark and brooding song, but it's a woman singing. I've never heard the song before. I'm 100% sure. And it just in my head, I went, I bet that's a Leonard Cohen song. And I was right. I think that he has an unmistakable style to how he even endeavors to write. And I just think that's inherently impressive. You can't say that about that many people.
I also think, coming from a fairly religious family, the spiritual side of him probably is someone who's questioning, especially at a young age, questioning where he's coming from and searching possibly for answers. And there's a lot of imagery in this album that kind of talks about like leaders and people followers and stuff like that. So I think there's this strong pull towards asking questions and searching, and he obviously has the drive to like, or had this passion for writing, and to get all that out probably wasn't that's probably what was going on with him at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the family was definitely very active in the Jewish faith. I believe his grandfather was a rabbi. I could be misremembering that.
So he was I just for all intents and purposes, I'm Jewish, and like he's of this line called the Cohen, or Kohanim, who are basically the rabbis, like the priest, the high priest, all the way that are supposedly a lineage down from Aaron, who is Moses's brother, who was the high priest back in biblical times. And so they were like kind of looked upon as like this like very religious special family. So he comes from that lineage.
Interesting.
A lot to live up to.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Supposed to be a high priest and like a conduit to God. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
How
it's
about
funny because
instead?
it's funny because he's also kind of like irreverent towards like religion in some of these songs in a way. He kind of talks about Jesus is like a hypocrite and failure and kind of stuff
Isn't
like
that
that.
common
And
for folks who
oh,
grow up like immersed in religion?
oh
Like,
yeah,
Oh,
for
yeah,
sure,
yeah.
for sure, absolutely.
I've always said
Yeah,
that
let's
the
see that.
quickest way to make sure your kids are atheists is to send them to a religious school. Afterwards, they're like, yeah, I'm done with this shit.
But I think he sees and appreciates the power of writing from an early age, because I think that is a part of the Jewish tradition, right?
Yeah.
People studying the Torah and things like that. So
he definitely has a voice. I mean, there's no question about that. He has a voice. He has. I like your point earlier, Rob, about being able to kind of pick out one of his songs in a needle in a haystack kind of thing. I think where and to address something you said earlier, I do think he has a way with words. That much is clear. I think where it just felt a little bit flat for me is that, and I was an English major, so I'm not like anti literature or anything. I just felt that when I learned of his career as a poet and how that led up to him being a musician, and there was just so much about his lyrics, and that's really his thing. I just expected maybe something a little different, or maybe something that like knocked my socks off a little bit more. Maybe I don't know what I was expecting, but I think as I looked at it as words on paper and heard it voiced over pretty like boring instrumentation, I think the package, I was just left feeling like I'm not sure I I get it, but there's still something there though.
Well, he's got the Bob Dylan thing going on, and this is where I think the Bob Dylan comp makes a lot of sense. And Rob, you've brought this up before. You listen to Bob Dylan's lyrics, and they're probably 75% just imagistic nonsense, and then he hits you with a really great line. And I think Leonard Cohen does the same stuff, where as I'm listening to these songs and it's kind of rambling and boring, and then it'll like slip in a really great line with really great imagery. And I'm like, I got to give it to you. That's pretty good. All right, you kind of sucked me back in with that one line, and then you're going to ramble a little bit more, and then you're going to hit me with another really good line in 20 seconds or something like that. They can't all be great lines. That would in itself become boring.
I just want to clarify my position on that topic of Bob Dylan. To me, that's like a setup and a punchline approach to writing, and I just want to be clear that I think the impressionistic painting pictures with your words often is really great as well, but it doesn't maybe have the same level of emotional impact as the punchline line. That's what I was trying to get across there. But ultimately, this is about a time and place. I think one of the most interesting things about Leonard is that he is significantly older than his 60s peers. So it's about a time and place. So when he's 15, we're in the kind of mid to late 50s, and he goes to be a camp counselor for a summer. And the head camp counselor is this like American socialist guy. And to hear Leonard tell it, socialists at that time were the only people who played guitar, basically. And by the way, socialist, it has a lot of different meanings throughout the years, but this was like supporting North Korea in the Korean War kind of socialist. This is the early 50s, right? But ultimately, this guy becomes kind of a little guitar mentor for Leonard. He shows them he has this songbook of pro-union, pro-partisan songs. Many of them are just like reworkings of old folk songs, and Leonard sets to studying this chord book very intently, kind of learns guitar via that over the summer.
Step one, never let your chords ring out.
It brought to mind the idea of like a revolutionary songbook. Are you guys familiar with the song Bella Ciao? Have we talked about this on the podcast? You might know the song if you heard it. It came on my radar a few years back, also from a TV show. They were singing it in Italian, which I think maybe is how it was originally written. And it was funny because then my wife, who grew up outside of America, was like, oh yeah, I know this song, but it's in Chinese. And I looked into it, and this song, which is originated as a revolutionary song, like peasants rising up against an oppressive government type song, is the most translated and recorded song like in all of history. There are versions in nearly every language on the planet. It's quite interesting.
But not English, because we're always the ones that they're fighting against.
Yeah.
It's a jam. You should check it out. But okay, so back in Montreal that fall, right? He's got a little bit of guitar knowledge with him, and he meets a Spanish guy playing flamenco guitar in the park. And Leonard doesn't really speak French. This guy doesn't speak English or French. So they somehow, through gesturing, agree to a guitar lesson. And this guy comes over to Leonard's like 3 times, shows him some really basic flamenco techniques, which Leonard practices incessantly, and which I think you can still hear are the basis of a lot of his playing. Now, interesting part of the anecdote, on the 4th lesson, the guy doesn't show up. Leonard, doesn't know why, doesn't hear from him. He calls around to the boarding house where he's staying. Turns out he committed suicide.
Fun.
So maybe this kid Leonard is a little bit of a bummer. It's unclear, but so like I said,
it's his fault. So what you're saying, I can't go back for another lesson. Jesus Christ, I can't do it.
Just thought that was kind of rough. So I love these, like the details of Leonard Cohen's, the little snippets of his musical career, because it takes so many odd turns. But like we said, the flamenco guitar playing kind of formed the basis. You can still hear that style on the record for sure. He ends up going to college at McGill, which is a big university in Montreal, and he forms a square dance band called the Buckskin Boys.
Right.
Which, square dance band, I mean, that's how old this was, that was a viable option to impress women.
If you spit into an AI generator, come up with a band name for that style of music, that tracks pretty well.
So, it's like through his teenage years, he's had these connections with music. He sees how music can win over people and gain him influence and things like that. But really his first career, and the thing he focuses the most on in college and beyond, is poetry. At around 20, he meets a poet mentor, a guy called Irving Layton, who's around 20 years older than him. And they sit around and they study poetry and they write poetry and they go to poetry readings. And Leonard ends up publishing his first book of poetry in 1956. That's 10 years before this record comes out, by the way. And it's called Let Us Compare Mythologies. And just for some context, that's the same year, 1956. It's the same year that Howl by Allen Ginsberg published. So poetry is kind of happening artistically. You know, the culture is changing fast, as we know, in America and perhaps other places, but the beats are really what's considered hip in youth culture. And so I just think that like frames it a little better. Now I should say the Beats didn't exactly think Cohen was cool even then, because Leonard Cohen was using a much more traditional version of poetry with rhyming couplets and things like that. And a lot of these beat poets were breaking down those barriers and things like that. But
rhymes, that's gotta have them.
What kind of weak ass poet rhymes? Come on. I do want to just bring up one anecdote, and I watched like a hour and a half long interview with Leonard Cohen on Canadian television, and this is maybe one of my own personal hangups here, but they talked about when he was a poet and when he was first starting as a poet and had graduated from college, he was still getting a $750 a year allowance from his parents to subsidize his career. And like, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, but he also said that he rented a house for $114 a month. So they basically were paying most of his way through life as he's trying to quote unquote make it as a poet. I don't know why that annoyed me, but it really did annoy me. And
well, we all know those kids, we all know those kids.
Exactly.
Like, how are you, you're 35 and you're still chasing the musical dream, and you seem to be not ever have a job,
Oh yeah,
like,
Portland,
well, my
Marty,
parents
that's probably
gave me
your
3
life.
Oh, that's like half. Yeah, it's like half the people in Portland I know.
Yeah.
Damn, how do you got a new car? You don't even have a job.
Yeah.
I'm not irritated by that as much, although sometimes that does rankle me to an extent. But like, I think where I have a little bit of just disbelief sometimes is when it comes to writing authentic music. Of course, you have feelings and thoughts, but I do find it hard to believe in someone who's summoning this darkness but is living a pretty cushy life. It's almost like playing the blues, where like
authenticity.
If your life isn't like a dumpster fire,
yeah.
are you really like playing the blues?
Yeah,
like
but
the second Rage Against the Machine album. What's there to left to rage at exactly?
I mean, there's also the aspect of he might be one of those types of people who like wanted to get out of his lifestyle and get more into that kind of like grimy, like earthy feel of like the lower class. I don't even know, like, but
No.
most of the people who were doing this and were like part of the beatnik movement and all that kind of stuff, and even later on, I feel like, especially in the 60s folk scene, were people who came from families with money, or were not like, we had the ability to do this stuff. So I think this pretty much tracks with a lot of what the eventual folk scene was going to be.
Yeah, there's not a lot of sons of coal miners that are out there being poets. And those guys got fucking jobs, but people who grew up and had the opportunity to go to college and all that stuff, they're the ones who are maybe a little bit more focused on the literary bend.
I mean, since you brought it up,
fair.
Loretta Lynn is the obvious example there.
Yeah, but she was not a musician, I think, because she was like, I have the music in me and I have to get it out. I think she was like, I can make some money doing this because otherwise my husband's going to continue to beat me very badly.
Well,
but he can't go in the face if I have to be on stage. So.
Interestingly, that's pretty much where Leonard was at. Well, listen, I just want to be. I don't fault people for being born with money. You don't get to control that.
Yeah.
And I think that Josh is right that a lot of people in that situation try to push away from it somehow, some way. And, we can criticize the details, but I think that is what Leonard was trying to do. So we're kind of in the section of Leonard's life where he's artistically successful, but no real money's coming in because people aren't really buying books of poetry. He's a mild literary sensation in Canada. And to keep his inspiration up, he's on some kind of stipend. He's got, book deals. He's working on a novel. He sets off to live a more interesting life, a more bohemian life. So he kind of moves around a lot in this period. He goes to London in the late 50s. Keep in mind, this is post-war, pre-Beatles London, so it's kind of a dark age for that city. From there, he goes to live on a small Greek island called Hydra, which has become like an artistic community of hippies. And at this point, he's like around 26. It's maybe 1960. He ends up meeting one of his muses there on Hydra called Marianne, who's referenced on this album. Was married to a Scandinavian novelist at the time, but kind of unhappy. So she kicks up a relationship with Leonard. He publishes a novel. He publishes more books of poetry, including a volume called Flowers for Hitler, which unsurprisingly does not sell very well.
I did see that there was a controversy about that because he got a grant from the Canadian government to further his artistic endeavors. And even at the time, he wasn't very famous or anything like that, but people were still upset because it was like you took a grant from the Canadian government and then moved to an island in Greece to live with a Scandinavian model and be like, yeah, no, trust me, I'm right. Don't worry about it. There's Flowers for Hitler. It's great.
Yeah, where do I sign up for that?
Yes, that.
I think I missed the auditions for that one.
Yeah.
So, but the bottom line is, right, age 30 is approaching. He's getting critical acclaim. He's getting published, but he ain't getting paid. He's published 2 novels. He's published 3 volumes of poetry, but the culture is moving on, and his approach to making art is considered antiquated already. Really, it was considered antiquated when he started, as we mentioned. So he ends up hanging out in New York. He thinks he's just going to pass through there, but he hears Bob Dylan playing in a cafe in Greenwich Village and starts thinking, maybe I could turn these poems into songs and make a record. Maybe I could be the Canadian Bob Dylan. Records sell, right? Simple plan. So, and it actually turns out to be quite a simple plan. He's on the scene. He starts asking around. His name kind of has some cachet, right? He shows up at Max's Kansas City, which is a very hip bar in New York at the time. And Lou Reed apparently recognizes him at the bar. He goes, hey, are you Al Pacino? And they talk. And basically he gets brought into this whole Andy Warhol gang in New York, like right away. I think my understanding is this is like one of the first couple nights he's even hanging out in New York. He meets Nico. He of course falls in love with her. They talk about her maybe recording one of his songs for her debut album. That doesn't actually happen, and then pretty quickly, a friend connects him with a singer called Judy Collins. And this is definitely the most fateful meeting of Leonard's life. Now, Judy Collins is a singer with a recording contract who doesn't write songs at this point. So she's always on the lookout for good songs, for new songs. And reminder to the listeners, this is the same Judy Collins who later was in a relationship with Stephen Stills, and about whom the song Sweet Judy Blue Eyes is written, by the way. But that comes a little later. So some producer, manager hooks the two of them up. Leonard goes over there. He plays her the song Suzanne that he has. He's very coy about it. He's like, is this a song? I don't know. Judy's like, it's a song, yeah, and I'm recording it tomorrow. And she does. And it's a hit. The record that Judy Collins puts out sells like 500,000 copies. And this is in 1966. So this kind of changes the trajectory of everything. Let's play a quick clip of the Judy Collins version of the song Suzanne. So speaking of luck and being born with a silver spoon, what's crazy is that he literally, once he decides to focus on music, he's only in New York for 2 months before he finds one of his songs on a hit record. That is some fast turnaround right there.
Are you going to touch on his first performance of Suzanne with Judy Collins? Because
yes.
That to me was like, I wanted to punch him in the face. I couldn't stand it. Sorry.
Well, to harken back to what I think Josh said earlier, that a lot of this feels very tentative, right? He's in the midst of this career change. He's not sure what he wants to do. He's not sure if he really is a singer or a performer or a songwriter. And he kind of is on the fence. And I think you can hear that both in the recording, you can hear that in the story of how long it took to record, which we're going to get to, and you can hear it in this story of his first American performance where Judy Collins, the record is a hit. People are, they're liking it, they're hearing it. They don't necessarily know who Leonard Cohen is, but then they look at the liner notes, they see his name. He's kind of on the tip of people's tongues, right? But no one has seen him yet. And she invites him on stage with her to sing it at some big show in New York. He's shaking. He's so nervous. He sort of fumbles through the beginning of the song. Then he stops in the middle, walks off stage, like pretty much the worst thing that could possibly happen to a performer. The biggest embarrassment you could possibly have happen to you. claiming he never wants to be a performer. She does eventually coax him back on stage and to kind of finish the song as a duet, but his debut does not go very well.
Well, according to Judy Collins, the crowd went nuts. Like when he walked off stage, they were like, "Oh, so avant-garde. Oh, just so interesting."
Like it's like an Andy Kaufman bit or something.
And I was just like, "Oh my God, how do you fall ass backwards into failing at the worst you can on stage?" And it turns out to be like very well received.
It's the antithesis of Bob Dylan Goes Electric, right? Like instead of Bob Dylan standing there defiantly saying, screw you guys, I'm playing this way. He's just like, I can't do this, leaves, and they're like they're cheering him for leaving, and suddenly he's a star.
But this is like classic New York '60s hipster story, right? He couldn't have game planned this better. I don't know how much strategy went into this, but he's already been given the kiss of acceptance by Andy Warhol. And you know what I mean? Once you have that kind of badge of honor on you, Lou Reed says you're cool and Nico says you're cool, then suddenly everyone wants a piece of you, right?
I will give him this. There were a lot of people who got blessed into the Andy Warhol circle who were just like, well, now my career is like cocaine and fucking, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm not actually going to have any artistic output. I'm just going to be super pretentious and do drugs and have sex. At least he had an output and was like, no, I think I'm going to continue to make music and do some stuff that has some validity down the line and not just run through the party, which I feel like a lot of people did. Just get
like who do you know that hung out with Andy Warhol that he hung out with tons of other artists and musicians and models and photographers and filmmakers and
yes.
Okay.
Well,
I should know who you're referring to.
Well, what I'm referring to are the people who never did anything and just became like club kids. Their entire thing was like, I'm a club kid. Well, a club kid just means you go to parties and have sex and hang out in various New York establishments.
So you're saying he had good work-life balance? Is that what you're saying?
Good work-life balance.
To be clear, even though he looks like your dad's accountant, he did his fair share of drugs, speed, Mandrax, you name it. He was into the party scene as well, but he did continue working. It's true. At this point, right, he's advised to make some rough demos of his songs, both to help court a label deal and also to have publishing sorted out. And an interesting connection I saw is that one of the copies of the demos went off to Garth Hudson of the band to transcribe them and make the charts for publishing. Apparently he was still taking these side gigs like this at the time.
Still charging $40 a month to his bandmates lessons. Yeah.
Exactly. But another copy luckily lands with John Hammond at Columbia. So April 26th, 1967, he gets signed to Columbia Records by the legendary John Hammond, who this guy, like, we could do a whole show about John Hammond. He's credited with discovering major artists across several decades: Billie Holiday, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Aretha Franklin, Stevie Ray Vaughan, just to give you an idea. Interesting guy who's been behind the music business for a long time. Leonard Cohen gets a $2,000 advance, and they set about trying to make his debut record songs of Leonard Cohen. So now finally we're at the recording phase.
So just curious, John Hammond, when he is helping him get his record contract, does he already have the idea for Jurassic Park in mind, or does that come later down the line?
He just finished his first series of organs, and then he met.
Yeah. Look, we need Adam here for organ talk. Okay, let's just stop it right there.
Oh God, thank God Adam is not here. Adam would have hated this album so much.
Okay, so let's talk recording, and then we're gonna get to the songs soon. So this recording takes place from May to November of 1967. So kind of a long time, given how stripped down the production is when you really think about it. Now, it started out with John Hammond just pairing him with a single accompanist, a bass player called Willie Ruff, who had played with Count Basie and Dizzy Gillespie. Really, really decorated player. And Leonard actually got along really well with the guy. He said he complimented his guitar playing really intuitively, and he was a rare musician who played selflessly. And then over time, I guess that was the goal, was to help work out the formats and the basis of the arrangements. And they brought in a bunch more studio killers and tried rock versions of the songs. And Leonard was like super embarrassed about how unsophisticated he was, musically speaking. And it doesn't sound like he really knew what he wanted. And him and John Hammond kind of fought about that. Leonard struggled to communicate in general, I think, of what his vision was. He knew what he didn't want, but that's kind of all he could do. A weird detail that I read is that Leonard felt most comfortable playing in front of a full-length mirror, so they had one brought into the studio. It's a strange little quirk. It's almost wholesome in its teenage bedroom tennis racket kind of vibe.
I feel like I read it was easy for him to see his like left hand chord formations when looking at himself in the mirror, but
it seems like he just practiced like that as a kid for whatever reason. But you would think that would lead to more confidence as a performer, but it didn't seem to do that. Anyway, it sounds like the last thing I would want to do while recording music.
Or anything.
But it got really bad. Leonard nearly swore off the entire process. He said it came down to just, can I finish it? Not can it be perfect? Not can it be immortal? Not even can it be good? Just like, can it be over with? They tried a bunch of things. They tried changing studio locations. They ended up at one point at a converted Armenian Orthodox church where Kinda Blue was recorded, the Miles Davis record. But it's still challenging, and Leonard's not satisfied. And my take from kind of reading between the lines here is that we ended up with something on the tape that is a lot closer to John Hammond's vision, because during this period, he was arguing for simplicity, that simplicity was Leonard's biggest asset. Whereas Leonard, I think, simply could not conceive that his voice alone would sell any records. So he's kind of grasping at like production tricks, but to disguise his inherently non-commercial voice in his mind, but he doesn't really know how production tricks work, and they're just kind of floundering, right?
What now? I misread, because I read that one of the producers, John Simon, connection to the band, who produced the band's second album, who did a bunch of other stuff, was in on one of the songs and wanted more, and that Leonard Cohen wanted less, and wanted things stripped down, and like he wanted like Simon wanted like drums and more guitars, and they fought about that.
Yeah, so this is what's weird. So basically, they take a break from the sessions because one, it's going so poorly, and two, John Hammond kind of falls sick, and this is where Leonard manages to squeeze in a quick love affair with Joni Mitchell. And I wonder if perhaps she
just toss that in there for good measure.
Yeah.
This is a total speculation, but I wonder if she, with her equally unconventional but amazing voice, maybe helps give him some confidence. I'm not sure. They only take a break for like 6 weeks. They restart the sessions again in October with a brand new producer, the guy that Josh just mentioned, a guy called John Simon. His big credit at the time was for the song Red Rubber Ball. The band that recorded that is called The Circle, although Circle is spelled weird. But more interestingly, the song was written by Paul Simon because he gave it to the band when they were opening for Simon and Garfunkel. So anyway, this is a minor hit. And I should mention John Simon, the producer, Paul Simon are not related, but check out Red Rubber Ball. It's kind of a cool song.
But they have the same last name.
They do have the same last name, yeah. So they argue about tons of things. Like Leonard ends up hiring a random band he sees at a club one night called Kaleidoscope. They're on some of the tracks. John Simon, you're right, Josh. Like he wanted more orchestration and bells and whistles. He adds his girlfriend's voice to the mix. And this all happens mostly after Leonard actually leaves the studio. So when Leonard first hears the original final mix, he is very upset with it. They quarrel over it. Leonard kind of wins back some of his vision, which I'm saying is really John Hammond's vision. Like, it just doesn't seem like Leonard ever really knew quite what he wanted, but maybe he reverted to the guy he trusted a little more, John Hammond, and it stayed somewhere in between, right? Now, I should mention that sadly, Leonard's passed away now, but he did loudly threaten to kill himself if the record didn't turn out well. So let's hope he doesn't hear any of this podcast and come back to haunt us. Okay, so finally the dang thing gets released December 27th, 1967. So it's basically a Christmas record, guys. And I thought I would just read you a couple quick pieces of reviews from when it came out. Rolling Stone wrote, "I don't think I could ever tolerate all of it. 3 brilliant songs, 1 good one, 3 qualified bummers, and 3 are flaming shits." I think we should invite this reviewer onto the show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The New York Times wrote that Leonard Cohen sounds like a sad man cashing in on self-pity and adolescent loneliness.
On point again.
I know many of those people, but the cashing out part hasn't.
Now, it was a little better received in the UK, but speaking of being better received, on to our favorite segment here, by the numbers. Let's do Leonard Cohen, songs of Leonard Cohen by the numbers. First number I want to throw out there is 33. We've already alluded to it, but that is the age that Leonard was when his first album came out, which in the culture of 1960s coolness may as well have been 75. He was as old as old can be. And, that said, though, the cover really leans into that element. It looks like your grandfather's passport photo.
I was going to say a
looks like he's
most
gonna give you
wanted
a lecture.
or a most wanted poster or something like that.
For
It's
tax evasion. Like,
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Next number I want to throw out to you guys is 83. That's the highest chart position this album ever saw in the US. It did chart a bit higher in the UK and surprisingly in the Netherlands. And it eventually, after long last, sold 500,000 copies. So it was kind of a real sleeper hit.
he is way more popular in Europe, right? Like,
Yes.
way more popular in Europe. I don't think this will be one of your by the numbers, but I saw something that in the 80s he played a show in Iceland where 5% of the nation's population came to the show.
Damn.
Well, that's fucking gigantic.
Jesus.
I mean, that might have only been 26,000 people or something in Iceland at the time, but it's still huge. Like, that's
He
ridiculous.
just played at the high school gymnasium.
Right. It was also the only event going on in Iceland that night.
That actually is probably very accurate. Yes.
Okay, the next number I want to throw out is the number 4. That's the number of albums that Leonard Cohen has on Robert Dimery's list, including his first 3 albums in a row. I'm not sure anyone else has such a track record, especially at the outset of their career. And I gotta say, I can't imagine it's deserved. I feel like it's over-indexed on Leonard Cohen, for sure.
Aren't the first 4 Zeppelin albums on there? Or is number 3 not on the list?
You're right. The first 4 Zeppelin albums are on there. Good call.
But that's also over-indexed on Zeppelin, by the way. Too much Zeppelin.
Yeah.
That one's maybe slightly more debatable.
I feel like there's sometimes this like retrospective thing that happens where in the moment there's not, the lack of commercial success is no surprise. Like there's no pop accessibility whatsoever on any of this. So I don't know. I'm always surprised at what later becomes the thing that critics love. As far as being the first 3 albums, though, I didn't really like dig into all of them, but am I correct that they sort of like hang together in a certain way, or that they're considered part of one era of his sort of songwriting before he gets a little bit more melodic? Or is that something?
Yeah, he has 3 that are like pretty stripped down, and then he has the big Phil Spector album.
Death of a Ladies Man.
Death of a Ladies Man, yeah.
I
and
saw
imagine-
that when he was making that album, he and Phil Spector were completely at odds as to how he wanted it to sound. And he said at the end of the day, when the recording day would be over, Phil Spector would have armed security guards come in and take the master tapes. And he was like, I was basically left in a position where if I wanted to have any creative input, I had to like fight people to actually get the master tapes so that I could, put my own imprint on the album. Which
Here's
That
the
doesn't
thing.
sound like Phil
See,
Spector at all.
No, yeah.
I might-
I know.
I don't know all the situation, but I might have to side with Phil Spector here. Like, why did you hire Phil Spector if you were not trying to get lush, big orchestration, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Maybe
let's
he was just,
finish
like,
out.
super into being shitty to women with him.
Let's finish out the segment by the numbers. Last number I want to throw out to you guys is countless. That's the number of times Leonard does not quite hit the note he was aiming for, but it doesn't matter, I guess, because, art. And speaking of striving ever so hard for something and still missing the mark consistently, we love doing this podcast, guys. We love that you love listening to it. We appreciate everything, all the emails, all the 5-star reviews, Patreon subscribers, the merch store purchases. We've recently been working on some bonus show stuff over at Patreon. You can go check that out. Even if you don't want to subscribe right now, you can take a closer look at what we've been doing and the community of nerds, music nerds, we're building together. So thank you for everything. That is our segue, guys, to starting to talk about some of these songs. You guys ready?